Quite a romantic picture, don't you think? Though for their time these ships were the best in the world, we may well wonder how those 16th century Dutch dared to cross the oceans in them. No radio, no radar, the captain's rheumatism by way of weather forecast. Always meager rations, 1 cheese per man for 4 months, if the maggots hadn't got to it first. Sometimes the captain had to stand by, cudgel in hand, while the food was being distributed, because all too often there would be a fight over the last moldy biscuit and a half flagon of water. Even from a clear sky, a roaring hurricane could spring up, wreaking havoc with the rigging, tearing the sails to shreds, and whisking overboard incautious souls. Sheer hell, in the freezing cold, the gales, the thunder, and the drenching rain. To be becalmed, on the other hand, could be worse. Drifting for months in the doldrums with supplies running out, and the crew beleaguered by strange diseases like bloody flux, putrid fever, and above all, the dreaded scurvy, for as yet, nobody knew about vitamin C. And so, time and time again, came the macabre search by the night watch for their dead companions. Thus, countless victims of those dread diseases were wrapped in sailcloth and consigned to the waves from under the national flag. Less decorously, some of the crew of the ship the Arnhem, which threatened to sink in a storm, were thrown overboard because the cargo was valued more highly than a handful of human lives. Anyone found drunk on watch would find themselves in irons without question. The crew consisted largely of the scum of the earth, and without iron discipline, any voyage would be doomed to failure. The fine for swearing was 6p. Anyone drawing a knife could be nailed to the mast, and any greater crime would mean keel hauling. This keel hauling usually happened in distant parts, but sometimes in the middle of Amsterdam harbor, in which case crowds would gather to revel in the unlucky man's misfortune. Any unknown coast had to be reconnoitered carefully. Friend or foe? That was the constant question. Fresh water could perhaps be found there, and food, crabs and turtles, game and exotic fruits. You could be hailed jubilantly as a white god and proclaimed chief of the tribe. But another throw of the dice could mean the whole expedition wiped out by the hostile natives with poisonous arrows and blowpipes, or being boiled alive by cannibals. Death also lurked in the sea. Many a sailor lost an arm or a leg to the sharks. Trade and war were inseparable, and at any time the blood flag could be hoisted and ships would rush to the attack with full sail and roaring cannons. Many a ship, through disease and death, storms and battle, fire and devastation, became a ghost ship, a Flying Dutchman, drifting crewless and unrigged till it was smashed to pieces on some rocky coast. To the Dutch, the sea has always been an enemy, but also a friend. The people who lived behind these dunes have learned to control this enemy. Back in the 16th century, they already had an ingenious system of dikes, land drainage, and reclamation. But a people so familiar with the power of the sea also felt the lure of the infinite and the fantastic possibilities of the unknown out there. And so they went, those Flying Dutchmen, across the seas in search of trade and profit, but also adventure.
En winst, maar ook naar avontuur.
Many a lucky beachcomber garnered a comfortable living out of all those seagoing activities. But real prosperity did not come to small towns behind the dunes like Egmond-on-Sea. For such places did not have a harbor. Apart from beachcombing, Egmond lived from fishing, the boats being merely pulled up the beach. The way home was only marked by a simple beacon, no more than a pole with a brazier hung at the top. Better accommodated for this new era were the towns which did have a harbor, like Enkhuizen, Hoorn, Amsterdam, and Flushing. Those were the towns naturally suited to send the Dutch across the seas, the springboards for the Golden Republic. Also Rotterdam, practically an island at the time, and only connected to the mainland by a small dike, shared abundantly in the new wealth. A main support for the Dutch prosperity had been for many years the herring. Around 1600, on the Dogger Bank and up the Thames, right under the nose of the English, a fortune in herring was caught. This gold mine meant work for thousands of Dutch fishermen, as well as a multitude of shipbuilders, sailmakers, coopers, and salt traders. All these people had reason to be grateful to a man from the little town of Beerfleet, Willem Beukelzoon, who in the 1400s had already provided the Dutch fishermen with their secret weapon in the shape of the famous herring gutting knife. Thanks to this ingenious little knife, herring which were caught at night could be gutted, salted, and barreled on the spot. A very good reason for the Dutch to annually celebrate the memory of this handy inventor. A nation of fishermen, merchants, shippers, and peasants, at war with occupying Spain for 80 years because they wanted freedom of religion and independence. They were not going to let Spain tell them what to do, and certainly not pay taxes to that cursed Governor Alva. In the guerrilla-like conflict, rebels and sea beggars seized the northern seaports. Inland, the citizens themselves defended their own towns against marauding Spanish expeditions. The whole of the south lay devastated, but the north, entrenched above the defense line of the great rivers, kept up a stubborn resistance to maintain its freedom. 7 obstinate provinces, keeping the enemy at bay. and at the same time doggedly building the Dutch miracle of the Golden Republic. In 1575, Amsterdam had been a small town encircled by the First Canal. For a long time, the Catholic elite managed to keep the town on the side of Spain, until merchants and traders took control and made Amsterdam a refuge for the thousands who came running from the south, bringing money and ideas. That is how, within 20 years, Amsterdam was able to rise like a shining beacon out of the contorted restrictions of medieval Europe. Anyone investigating the secret which lay behind this Dutch outlook and free climate inevitably comes across Erasmus of Rotterdam, who preached tolerance, peace, humanitarianism, power of reason, and freedom of thought. It was this freedom of thought that made Holland a haven of tolerance, where no heretical theses or so-called diabolical invention would be threatened with the scaffold or the Inquisition. And they came by the thousands, flocking in from the ruins of Antwerp, but also English, Scandinavians, Scots, Jews, and even Armenians and Turks, all enticed by the land of unlimited possibilities, of fortune and happiness, the new focus of science and culture. The old quarter of Enkhuizen has hardly changed since the end of the 16th century, when a couple of adventurous youths were born, who were to become of major significance to the Dutch expansion. One of these pioneers was Jan Huygen van Linschoten, who by way of Spain and Portugal came into the service of the Archbishop of Goa, the center of Portuguese power in India. Goa Harbor was the meeting point of all Portuguese ships coming from all points of the compass. That's where Jan Huygen van Linschoten could be found whenever he managed to escape the watchful eye of his clerical master. Gradually, the Portuguese sailors got used to this curious young Dutchman, who could never stop asking them about their travels in the Far East. And of course, they let him know when one day a ship from China came in with a Dutch gunner on board. This compatriot was Dirk Gerritson Pomp, who as a boy had gone into the wide world, because, as he said to his virtuous father, "No time is more wasted than that which is spent by a young man in his mother's kitchen." The encounter between these two free-spirited youths from Enkhuizen on the quay at Goa was of historic significance for the Dutch expansion. Dirk Gerritson Pomp happened to be the first Dutchman to visit Japan and China, which earned him the nickname Dirk China. Dirk China himself never wrote down any of his experiences, but he did know how to tell a story. Just like Jan Huygen, Dirk China kept his eyes and ears open, not only for the unfamiliar customs of distant peoples, but also for sea routes and currents, especially for the secret Portuguese charts, which would reveal the riches to be gained and how to get to it. In effect, these pioneers acted as spies for the emerging Dutch nation. Many of Dirk China's stories form the basis of the famous book Jan Huygen wrote on his return to Enkhuizen, the Itinerario, which colorfully revealed the exotic mysteries of the Far East. For the Dutch, these far-off countries had always been forbidden territory, since the Pope, in his infinite wisdom, had simply divided the world in half, The eastern half he donated to the Portuguese. The western half was for Spain. This church in Amsterdam was, at the time, the domain of a man who disagreed totally with the Pope and his division of the world. He was violently anti-papist, the Reverend Petrus Plancius. He was not only a minister of the church, but also a pupil of the great map-maker Mercator. Every week, this Plancius would climb to the pulpit, not so much to preach as to instruct the skippers and mates in the art of navigation. This fanatical preacher was the intellectual focus and the initiator of the Dutch expeditions which within 5 years had covered most of the world. At the instigation of this single-minded cleric, they first tried to reach the riches of Asia by sailing straight across the North Pole in an effort to outwit the Portuguese. This idea turned out to be unfortunate for the brave men who made the attempt and got stuck in the frozen wastes of Nova Zembla. The only thing to be gained from these northern ice worlds was the whale. Many whalers, harpooners, and Frenchmen from the northern Dutch islands earned a good living out of this chilly job. So the northern route was abandoned, which left the south, Portuguese or no Portuguese, round the stormy Cape of Good Hope with its distinctive Table Mountain. For a long time, this spot was used by the Dutch as a kind of letterbox, where passing skippers would leave letters under a large boulder which everyone knew how to find. Discoveries were made, such as the unknown island that was immediately named Mauritius, after Stadtholder Maurits. The first sailing to Indonesia was plagued by disaster, but Java was reached eventually, and it was there that the Dutch first got wind of the growing antipathy in the East towards the Portuguese, and of the possibilities of direct trade and profits. Profits especially to be made on the coveted spices, pepper, nutmeg, and cloves. At the same time, the Dutch also sailed into the western Spanish half of the world. In North America, the budding gold fever didn't come to much, but a Dutch colony sprang up anyway on the island of Manhattan, which was bought from the Indians for 60 guilders. And there they founded a new town, New Amsterdam, later to become New York, with a Dutch church, a Dutch lighthouse, and a Dutch windmill. The little village of Olinda near Pernambuco was the first bridgehead from which the Dutch eventually wrested Brazil from the Portuguese in order to obtain control of the sugar trade. And it was there that the Dutch subsequently ventured into the business of slave trading. Countless numbers of slaves were brought in from Africa to be resold to the new colonies. In 1602, Queen Elizabeth died. But to the budding Republic of the Dutch, that year had quite another significance. Not simply because that year a giant whale was washed ashore, attracting all kinds of town and country folk to gape in awe at the monster from the icy north. More to the point, 1602 was the year in which Johann van Oldenbarneveld, a leading figure in the Republic, finally succeeded in ending the ruthless competition between the provinces, towns, and companies, which were all exploring the world on their own behalves, much to the exasperation of the newly created States General. Even Prince Maurits, the stadtholder, had to use his authority and bully the uncooperative Zealanders into giving their consent and support for the founding of the Dutch East India Company on March the 20th, 1602. The regulations of this new company were dominated by two main points: to gain maximum profits for the Netherlands and to inflict maximum damage on the enemies, Portugal and Spain, a most belligerent multinational company, come to think of it. The intellectual power behind all this was the famous lawyer Hugo de Groot, who made his name not only through a spectacular escape in a bookcase, but primarily as the founder of international law and promoter of the concept that the sea is the property of all nations, and thus free for unlimited shipping and trade. The United Dutch East India Company had its headquarters in Amsterdam, as well as local branches in the provinces. Already after 1 month, the board of directors, the 17 gentlemen as they were called, proudly proclaimed the fact that shareholders from all social classes had brought together no less than 6 million guilders. It really became a national enterprise, drawing support even from the humblest servant who would stake up to a full month's wages. They hardly ever saw any return, for the 17 gentlemen would spend their savings mainly on expensive warfare, and anyone who dared to claim his interest would risk being accused of high treason. Only after 8 years were the first dividends paid, alas, not in money but in kind, a small bag of pepper. Pepper and salt are now everyday commodities taken for granted to season our fried eggs. It's hard to believe that the pursuit of these simple ingredients could have inspired the Dutch around 1600 to such daring expeditions across the oceans. To the west, for salt, which they needed badly, the Dutch carried it in shiploads from the Caribbean beaches. To the east, for pepper, which in those days was one of the most expensive spices. It's a simple story, but it had far-reaching consequences. The Pope was not the only one to divide the world in two, for so did the Dutch, when after the East India Company, they also founded a West India Company, giving each of them 1/2 of the world to explore. The sudden expansion meant an enormous boom for the shipbuilding industry. All Dutch wharves were buzzing with activity. One ship after another was launched, and from all over Europe, people came to see that marvel of Dutch naval architecture, the flute ship, and the proud East India trading vessels, which every year were pulled over onto their sides to be sealed with boiling tar. All these activities meant prosperity for many thousands, and even the poorest could scrape together a decent living here by scrounging at low tide for the nails which had slipped through the craftsman's fingers. Many farewell tears were shed at the Montalban Tower in Amsterdam, where sailors, gunners, surgeons, cooks, and other company servants would board the lighters which took them under the bridge to the sailing ships gathered in the outer harbor. The two big companies soon employed over 10,000 men. At least 7,000 of them were soldiers from the lowest social ranks, recruited in the pubs, and of course lots of foreign mercenaries too, mainly from Germany and Scandinavia. An unruly bunch of barbarian boors, louts, loons, and clodhoppers, with the grass still sticking between their teeth. That's how they were referred to. The loneliest and most difficult job was that of captain, or skipper as he was usually called. It was he who had to keep a tight rein on everything during the long voyage on those little floating worlds. And it was he, too, who had to record all the goings-on board, but especially all that could be found out about currents, storm areas, and unknown coasts. These captains' logbooks provide not only fascinating information, but also an insight in the character of these pioneers, who in the isolation of their cabin confided many a personal reflection, as well as some revealing illustrations to paper. If a ship wasn't navigated properly, it would soon drift at the mercy of winds and currents, ending up anywhere but at its destination. Thanks to the openness of mind, which encouraged every new idea and invention and stimulated every branch of science, the Dutch were far ahead of their contemporaries in the art of navigation. Time measurement was the basic principle of navigation. Every half hour, the watch would ring the bell and turn the glass to state the time, and at fixed intervals, the ship's position was determined with a compass, charts, and other navigational aids. Some of these ancient instruments can be found in the Amsterdam Maritime Museum, like this sextant, or Jacob staff, which was used to determine the ship's latitude. It's a long straight piece of wood graduated in degrees with several crossbars. 2, 3, or even 4, as on the one there. Generally, one would do. This long one was used when the sun was high in the sky, and the smaller one when it was lower. The Jacob staff was put just beneath the eye to get the bottom in line with the horizon and the sun on top, sometimes at the expense of an eye, in case one stared into the sun too long. Once the crossbar was fixed in the right position, the number of degrees could be read from this end, and after some ingenious calculation, the exact latitude could be determined. Willem Jansson Blau's Light of Navigation was an improved version of another famous Dutch standard work, The Mariner's Mirror, which had been translated into English as early as 1588. These guides soon became the A to Z of navigation for every sailor all over the world. And since that same world had finally conceded that the Earth was round instead of flat, the movements of the solar system and the position of the distant stars became a reliable basis for navigation at night. Maintaining the right course and keeping record of the distance covered was a meticulous job involving not only the compass, but also an important instrument called a peg compass. This is a peg compass. Lacking dial or needle, it's simply a sort of peg board on which the various points, north, south, east, and west, are marked. The watch was in charge of the peg compass, and as soon as he came on duty, he would insert the first peg in the hole corresponding with the direction in which the ship was going. Half an hour later, this procedure was repeated and another peg inserted. 4 hours later, the period of his watch, he would report the results to the captain to be recorded in the logbook.
Deze gegevens werden daarna overgenomen in het logboek.
Another item to be recorded in the log was the distance the ship had covered, which could only be calculated if one knew the speed, so every hour the speed was measured as well with the aid of the hand log. The hand log was a cone-shaped piece of wood tied to a long string, which is knotted at regular intervals. As soon as the wood hits the water, it is carried away by the current, unreading the string. When the red marker goes by, an hourglass is turned, and the number of knots passing in 30 seconds is counted. That's why the speed was recorded in knots, a word still used today, even if the procedure has changed.
Stop!
Land ho! Was a shout which at the end of every voyage would quicken the heart of every creature aboard, from the highest master to, if not eaten, the lowest pig. But the same exciting shout would send shivers up the spine of the first mate, for every unknown coast bristled with dangerous sandbanks, cliffs, and hidden rocks, which would tear apart even the most solid wooden keel. And the depth had to be plumbed continuously, while the ship approached with utmost caution. Many ships owed their survival to the ever-improving charts made in Holland by famous men like Hondius and Mercator, and especially Johann Blau from Amsterdam, whose maps were used by every seagoing nation. But apart from charts or other means of navigation, success or failure in those turbulent days depended above all on the knowledge and the instinct of the men who were literally and figuratively at the helm. In fact, they numbered no more than a handful, dauntless leaders now braving the icy northern waters, next to be found in the deepest south. Of course, they were almost all acquainted with each other. Men like Jacob van Heemskerk, here welcoming his redoubtable colleague Joris van Spilbergen, and other well-known men like Michiel Pauw, founder of the West India Company, Gerrit Bikker, the entrepreneur, Cornelius Houtman of the Indonesia voyage, the rebellious Gerrit van Beuningen, Sebald de Weert, discoverer of the Falklands, Jan Pieterszoon Koen, the Iron Man, Laurens Real, the diplomat, Piet Hein, the scourge of South America, and the conqueror of Curaçao, Johan van Walbeek. Here and there, fixed rallying points were established on the oceans, where ships and sometimes entire fleets would meet in order to hold council aboard the flagship. And there it was that all these seasoned skippers and discoverers would foregather, each with his own experience of currents and prevailing winds, of unknown coasts and reliable or treacherous charts. They would wrangle and dispute over the best way to get where the 17 gentlemen had planned they should go. Each one had his own interests, his own knowledge, and his own instinct. But the burden of the final decision was always carried by one single man, whose judgment would determine the fate of hundreds of people. The final authority, lonely at the top, the Admiral. Loneliness was also the fate of the Dutch at their trading posts on the other side of the world, as in Japan, where for over 2 centuries they were shut off in complete isolation on a small artificial island in the Bay of Nagasaki. The Japanese, a nation of tradition, swords, and samurai, felt an envious respect for the Dutch expertise with mortar and cannons, and so were eager to obtain these skills. In this exotic world, the Dutch had to throw in all their tact and diplomacy to secure the profitable trade in gold, silver, copper, and the very popular Japanese porcelain. For the sake of profit, the Dutch were prepared to grovel in the dust, or to curry favor with rare and costly gifts, a new type of animal, or this gigantic chandelier, which much impressed the ruthless military ruler of Japan, the shogun. Gifts were not only going from Holland to Japan. The shogun, too, would donate the occasional treasure, like, for instance, this exquisite Japanese lacquer cabinet, the decorations of which refer directly to the Dutch presence in Japan.
Die erop staan hebben direct te maken met het Nederlandse verblijf in Japan.
All over the world, from Japan to Brazil, and from New Zealand to Spitsbergen, the Dutch have left their traces. Entire small islands could be transformed into a single fortress. On many a distant shore, fortifications were erected to defend the often vulnerable positions against the attacks of competing nations, as well as hostile natives. Many of these strongholds have been deserted and have fallen into ruin, but others are still standing, with the distinctive pepper box watchtowers on the corners, from which both sea and hinterland could be covered with cannons. Typically Dutch fortress engineering in exotic foreign lands. Generally accessible from the sea as from the land. The landward gates especially were often elaborately decorated with the Dutch lion, the coat of arms of the House of Orange, and of course the emblem of the East India Company. Even today, street names in the most unexpected places still remind one of this particular era in Dutch history. Churches, too, in all corners of the world and of various architectural styles, but all unmistakably Dutch in character and solidity. How long is eternity? Eternity, or paradise, was not what the Dutch were searching for in these far and unfamiliar worlds. They were there for the trade and for the profit to be made on all these exotic articles and precious spices. And so the Amsterdam Exchange became the financial heart of a Dutch trading empire which encompassed the entire world. Rotterdam, too, had its own exchange in those days, and there as well, the financial wizards worked magic with Holland's economic trump card of the time, an interest of only 3% on borrowed capital, while all other countries were charging twice as much. All of Europe doubted the ability of such a motley collection of peasants, fishermen, and salt traders to rule themselves without the strong hand of a real king. But after a while, even Queen Elizabeth I had to concede, albeit grudgingly, that we kings have much to learn from the Dutch, as their form of government is so full of good order and worthy measures that it exceeds everyone's comprehension. In addition to a head office in Amsterdam, both the East and the West India Company maintained branches or chambers in the main ports elsewhere in the country. Enkhuizen, now a sleepy little town, used to be one of them. In those days it was a hive of activity. In Hoorn, too, there used to be such a chamber, where trade flourished under the dynamic influence of the powerful merchants, and where the warehouses were filled with treasures from across the seas. Hoorn, by the way, is also the birthplace of the founder of the Dutch colonial empire, Jan Pieterszoon Koen. Delft, too, was not without support among the 17 gentlemen. Jealous Middelburg even had 4 votes on the board, representing the entire province of Zeeland. But the unchallenged leader of all the cities was always Amsterdam, the city which had completely upstaged old Antwerp and had become the center of influence, trade, and prosperity. Another reason why Amsterdam called the tune was because it had no less than 8 votes in the board of 17, where most other cities only had 1. And the smaller town's fear of total domination by Amsterdam soon proved well-founded. All important enterprises were initiated in Amsterdam, and from there, the entire international trading empire was controlled. It's hard to imagine that this narrow little street, the Warmoestraat, used to be the most important street in Amsterdam. This is where the big entrepreneurs lived, like Reinier Pauw at number 14, one of the founders of the East India Company. And at number 5, Jacob van Neck, the man of the long voyages to Indonesia. And over there, Jan Poppen, a former servant who rose to become the wealthiest man in Amsterdam. This is where it all began, in the Warmoestraat. Naturally, once the East India Company had been founded, the Warmoestraat soon became too gloomy and too shabby for the big bosses. And what's more, they were beginning to get fed up with living on top of their merchandise day and night. So one after the other moved to the more luxurious canals which were being built in those days. Amsterdam, the tolerant capital of this unfettered land, was expanding, one ring after another of houses and canals, expanding to the rhythm of riches, a product of the Dutch miracle. And when in 1648, even the Spanish kings decided to capitulate, bringing an end to 80 years of war, the joy was complete. In that very same year, the old town hall on the Dam Square in Amsterdam was demolished. In its place was to rise the embodiment of peace and prosperity, the ultimate symbol of power of the most important trading city of Europe. The eighth wonder of the world, Amsterdam Town Hall, now the Royal Palace. The architect, Jacob van Kampen, and a host of sculptors, artists, and craftsmen labored for 20 years before this eighth wonder of the world was to tower over the Dam Square. Every detail of this building is a hymn of praise to the power and the glorious rule of Amsterdam, as expressed by the Amsterdam Virgin, who, surrounded by the goddesses of abundance, trade, strength, and wisdom, commands the entire universe. Here in the citizens' room of Amsterdam, the 17th century visitor was allowed to walk this marble floor, which is inlaid with a representation of the world as it was known in those days. He could follow the routes which the Dutch ships had taken to all parts of the globe, ships which had brought trade, prosperity, and wealth to the Low Countries, but above all, to Amsterdam. For Amsterdam was the thriving hub, the intellectual nucleus, not only of these Low Countries, but of the entire world. Within 50 years, Amsterdam had grown to 5 times its former size. 50 years of trading, waging war, and voyages of discovery. 50 years of unprecedented growth in power and prestige.
Thank you.